Welcome to my live session. It's great to see you all. If you're joining me today, say hi. What I wanted to do today was read you a story. So kick off your shoes, grab a drink, and let's get started. I'm going to be reading some excerpts from the American Chamber of Horrors. Here we go. In the 1930s, a woman wrote to Mrs. Roosevelt a letter, and I'm going to read that to you. Here we go. Dear Mrs. Roosevelt, I have been informed by a number of people that you are interested in this fight against poison cosmetics, and if you don't happen to be the one that this letter should be sent to, I am sure that you will be kind enough to see that it reaches the right person, as I hear this is to come before the next Congress. I am sure that you are a very busy woman, and I will make my story as brief as possible, and you will have to excuse all mistakes as I am unable to read what I have written. In March of 1930, I started using Creme Lu cream, and a few weeks later, I became very ill from then until now, which is almost 4 years. I have never been well as a result of using this cream. From April 1930, I suffer all kinds of pain, had teeth removed and 2 other small operations, had paralyzed feet, unable to walk all of this time. I was doctoring with the very best doctors in Indianapolis, but they were unable to find out what was wrong with me. In April 1931, I started losing my eyesight. I was then sent to the Mayo Clinic at Rochester, Minnesota, in hopes that they might find what was wrong with me. It was there I discovered that I was suffering from thallium poisoning from the use of Creme Lu cream. Since then, I have been every place that I have thought there might be a doctor who might be able to help me. Every doctor I go to tell me the same thing, that I have retrobulbar neuritis with optic nerve atrophy, for which there is no cure. I am sure you understand now why I'm writing this letter, in hopes that it may be the means of helping someone else. I was a girl 26 years old when I started using this cream, working every day, and that was my greatest pleasure in life, my health and being able to work and earn my own living. And now I will never work again. I could go on and on writing what this has meant, and I will mean in all the years to come to me, but I will sum it all up in a few words by saying, it took from me all I had that made life worth living, my eyes. There are laws to punish people for committing murders, and it seems as though there could be something to prevent carelessness that wrecks lives and makes people invalids all the remaining days, which is far worse than death. Mrs. Roosevelt, please don't think I have grown bitter and sour on life because I have not, but I have suffered so much, and I just want to help others from having the same thing happen in their lives. So what the heck is this woman talking about? What is this letter about? Well, it turns out that before 1938, cosmetics weren't regulated, and although a fair amount of the purveyors providing cosmetics acted justly and they provided safe cosmetics, there were some players that were not providing safe cosmetics, and these were being sold to the consumer, and unfortunately from that you had all of these atrocities happen. And so that's what happened in this one case with this woman who used Creme Lu skin cream, and unfortunately it costed her her sight. And so these incidents that were happening were cropping up all over the US, and so some people, a lot of activists, decided to do something about it. And so that's what we're going to read about today. And what was really interesting is that this excerpt, and all excerpts that I'm reading today, come from this book called The American Chamber of Horrors, and it was written in 1936, so 2 years before the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was passed. It was passed in 1938, and so this was written in 1936 by a woman, excuse me, named Ruth DeForest Lamb. She was the Chief Educational Officer at the FDA, and what was interesting about this time was she wrote this book because the American public was concerned that the FDA was being callous and insensitive to all of these atrocities that were happening that we're going to talk about. But what was really happening here was just that the FDA had no legal jurisdiction to protect people from their cosmetics, right? It wasn't part of their legal jurisdiction to be able to protect people yet. And that is what the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was all about, was regulating cosmetics that at this time were not regulated. So we're going to talk about 3 really impactful stories today. We're going to get back to Creme Lu, but we're going to start off with Lash Lure. And I talked about Lash Lure in one of my videos last week. And if you're there, definitely say hi. I haven't done it. Oh, hey, it's the Hair Lab. Hi, Hair Lab. How are you doing? I am reading some excerpts right now from the American Chamber of Horrors. Oh my goodness, these comments disappear so quickly. Let me see if I can actually get them back. Okay, so they moved fast. You asked a really good question, but I didn't get to read the whole thing. So what I'll do is I will address the questions that I have at the end of the live because they do go pretty quickly. Or what I'll do is I will start to take I'll take questions at the end of the paragraph so that I can make sure I address everything. So I'm sorry for missing your question. We'll do it again in a few so I can make sure that I answer people's questions. This is my first time doing YouTube Live in a while, so I haven't had many questions on here yet. So thank you, Hair Lab, for asking. All right, let's get started. We're going to start with Lash Lure. On the morning of May 17th, 1933, a charming lady, whom we shall know as Mrs. Brown, drove downtown to have her picture taken. She had worked hard all winter as secretary of the local Parent Teachers Association and as chairman of the entertainment committee. That evening, her associates were giving a banquet in her honor. They had asked for a picture of her to put in the state PTA magazine, so she was having it made. An hour later, she stopped at Bird's Beauty Shop to get a shampoo and a haircut. But since this was to be a special occasion, and she naturally wanted to look her best, she was a lovely-looking woman, she let herself be persuaded to have her brows and lashes touched up. To her amazement, this proved to be an elaborate procedure, and the girl made such a mess of it that it took the better part of an hour to get it cleaned up. Mrs. Brown drove home. Her eyes were beginning to smart a bit, as if she had gotten something in them. 2 hours later, they were so badly irritated that she could hardly see. When boric acid gave no relief, she bathed them with 10% argyrol, made up fresh by her druggist. For the burning sensation on her forehead and under her eyes, she applied yellow oxide of mercury ointment, as any physician might have done, but the pain grew steadily worse. Her face was smarting, her nose was stuffy and runny, her head ached, and she felt as miserable as if she were coming down with a cold. How could she ever sit through the banquet? As the guest of honor, she felt she had to go, and she forced herself to stick it out until 9 o'clock. By that time, however, she was so uncomfortable that she had to go home. All night, her eyes pained her horribly. In the morning, she wasn't unable to open them. They were draining profusely, and her face, especially around the eyes, was badly swollen. An eye specialist was called, but he had never encountered a case of this kind before. When her eyes did not respond to treatment, and he did everything for her that was humanly possible, he had his patient removed to the Miami Valley Hospital, where several eye specialists saw her in consultation. A large ulcer and several small ones developed on each eye. The pain became so agonizing and the general bodily discomfort so great that none of the many sedatives used was successful in procuring more than 15 minutes to 2 hours of rest a night. The nurse's laconic bedside notes during those long, slow weeks of torture, even after she had returned to her home, barely sketched the anguish that Mrs. Brown was going through. And thus it went on for weeks, day after day, night after night, of intense physical suffering, made more unbearable by the fear that she would never see again. Not only until the 1st of August, more than 2 months after her visit to the beauty shop, was Mrs. Brown able to walk out on the veranda with a nurse at her elbow. Although 8 specialists worked on the case with untiring devotion, matched by the patient's wonderful fortitude and gallant spirit, but through the chemical nature of the dye was readily analyzed, no antidote for the poison was known, nor has even yet been discovered. Corneal ulcerations in both eyes resulted in the sloughing off of the cornea and degeneration of the eyeballs, a condition with several operations have failed to help. Mrs. Brown's laughing blue eyes have been blinded forever. So just to pause here for a second before I continue with the Lash Lure story, to take any comments now, and I guess give my own commentary on it, is imagine going blind from your cosmetics. And next week we'll be addressing the question about whether this could still happen today or not, and talking a little bit more about the impact that the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act has had, in addition to its weaknesses. But yeah, it's a pretty heavy story. So before I continue on, I wanted to ask you guys if you had any comments on this, because I can read things now. Let's see. I'm looking at the comments. It doesn't look like we have anything yet. I believe the question that I saw earlier from Hairlap was asking about cosmetic regulation in Europe. And so what I'll do is I'll try to share more of that in a post, mostly because I will need to update myself on that as well. I reside in the US, so I do know a little bit about European cosmetic regulation, but I would like to do a post on it so I can tell you guys about it in more detail and also update myself as well. So let's continue with Lash Lure. In the spring of 1934, at the very time opponents of the Copeland Bill were fighting tooth and nail to keep an effective measure for the control of dangerous cosmetics from being reported out of committee, Lash Lure claimed another victim. This time it was a Florida woman, 52 years old, who had the dye applied to her right eyebrow and lashes by her own daughter, a beauty parlor operator. The adjacent tissue began to swell and burn within 30 seconds, so that it was thought best not to treat the other side. 8 days later, after a violent illness, the woman was dead. Just how many women have been injured by the use of this preparation, there is no way of knowing. But the Journal of the American Medical Association had reported at least 17 authentic cases. Wow. Sorry, stepping out of this for a second. 17 authentic cases. That's a lot. And there have no doubt been many others, for the first has settled a number of what is termed nuisance cases for small sums. Still other claims for damages have been paid by the beauty shops or their insurance companies. But what compensation is money, even if these women can get any, for the loss of their sight and the anguish they have undergone? All right, I am going to skip some of this because it is a long story, but I want you to know that I'm going to include in the comments the link to the American Chamber of Horrors so that you can read this yourself, and I recommend that you should read it because it is really impactful, and a lot of the debates they're having are really relevant to today, believe it or not. Like, I saw a lot of the debate over how much the government is responsible and how much we're responsible for when it comes to our cosmetics, and it's a healthy debate. It's interesting to hear that they were having it back in the 1920s and that we're still having that debate on many levels today. And so that's something definitely that's worth reading, and you can track the whole thing. Another thing was that I mentioned in the previous paragraph about the Copeland Bill. Just so you know, the Copeland Bill is what became the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of today. So when you hear about the Copeland Bill, sometimes they call it the Tugwell Bill as well. That's referring to the same thing. That was basically the bill that was being revised and revised that led up to this. So I'm going to continue with Lash Lure because we have two more stories to get to in addition to this. And just for those of you guys who are just joining, just so you know, this is just me reading some excerpts and responding to your comments. So definitely kick back, listen in, enjoy your tea. I'm going to have a swig of mine before we continue here, and we're going to move forward. Excuse me, forgive the cough. All right. When the facts about Lash Lure came to light, the Food and Drug Administration were powerless under the Food and Drug Act to seize the product and get it off the market, since the labeling bore no remedial claims for disease. But the administration did attempt to warn the public against this caustic beautifier, capable of burning the very eyeballs out of your head. A good many newspapers, be it said to their credit, published the warning forthwith, though in Buffalo, despite the urging of the city health officer and the local food and drug chief, not a paper in the city would print it. And what did the manufacturer do? Well, he arranged to have prospective victims sign the little document on the facing page before the dye was applied to their lashes. While notoriety and damage suits have driven the Lash Lure concern into hiding, its sight-destroying cosmetic is still being sold. So imagine knowing that these atrocities existed and still being able to sell a product. One of the things that came out of the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act was something called an injunction, meaning that the government can cease you from doing something or selling something, and so that is a privilege that is now granted to us with the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. All right, continuing. This villainous product is prominently displayed in the window of a beauty shop here in Washington, even as I write. The proprietor frankly admits that as long as her patrons will take the chance, she will continue to use the poison on their eyes, regardless. All right, well, that is it for Lash Lure. Does anybody have any comments, any questions? If not, what I will do is continue on to the next story, but I hope you're enjoying what I'm reading. Hair Lab, hey, there it is. I'm gonna read this really fast because they seem to disappear quick. I'm wondering if there is something like this could happen again due to the trend of DIY cosmetics. Yes, it can. It can, and we're gonna talk a little bit about that next week with tints. And in fact, I'm gonna use this as a chance to plug you, Hair Lab, because I've been checking out your content and you talk a lot about preservatives and how important they are. And I wanna offer you an opportunity to come on this channel and talk to us a little bit more about some preservatives because there are a lot of things happening today that really echo some of the concerns in this document and might make us think that we're not as far from the 1920s as maybe we think in terms of the debate on what's safe with cosmetics and or if our cosmetics are safe or not. And so yes, preservatives and us moving away from preservatives, that's something that is definitely providing a challenge for us this day and age. Hey, yeah, no problem. I'm so excited to have you, to have you watching this live cast, and hopefully it would be great to have you on this channel. So expect to hear from me afterwards. I would love to talk to you. Also, for those of you guys who are catching this episode or this video, I'm going to do it again shortly on Instagram. So if you're over there, feel free to follow over there too. So yeah, there's a lot of challenges. I'm going to be talking about eyelash tint next week, and the challenges with that. We're going to talk about if you could have Lash Lure happen again in modern times. So all those are discussions we'll be having. I'm going to move on to the next story here. It is about Grode's Oriental Skin Cream. So let's talk about that. Oh, hey, Beren. Hi, it's nice to see you. Excellent. I'm glad that you can't wait for the upcoming episode. Neither can I. All right, let's get to Grode's Oriental Skin Cream. Here we go. And just so you know, Grode's used mercury. It used a mercury compound. So we're going to be talking about mercury now. All right. The criminal cosmetics for use on the skin are those containing mercury. The whiteners and freckle removers, which may not stop with the freckles, but burn right down to the second layer of skin, causing terrible blisters. Mercury is readily absorbed through the intact skin and mucous membranes. The kidneys are early involved in cases of mercury poisoning. The mouth and gums become inflamed and ulcerated. The teeth drop out and the jaw begins to mortify. Several cases are nearly always fatal. In the Journal of this American Medical Association a few years ago, Dr. J.B. Blashill of Detroit reported the case of a Romanian woman without children whose husband thought her face was dirty. But the trouble was that she had been using Othine for a year and a half. And just so you guys know, Othine was another cosmetic that had mercury compounds in it. She was rubbing it thoroughly into her face and neck every night before she went to bed and left it on all night. Meanwhile, her face was getting more and more discolored, turning a sort of slatey blue-gray until even the neighbors ragged her about it. Though she was naturally swarthy, the doctor in the clinic was struck by the dark, dirty appearance of her face the moment he saw her in the doorway. At a distance, her face and neck did look dirty. When the doctors removed a mole, excuse me, let me say that again. When the doctors removed a mole from her neck and studied the surrounding tissue, they found the mercury was deeply embedded in the layers of her skin. Local treatment was of slight value, for it was almost impossible to get at the mercury. Such discoloration seems to depend somewhat on susceptibility and on the manner and degree of application, for not all users of mercury preparations are affected in this way. Sometimes the discoloration does not turn up until after a long time after the cosmetic was first used. In one case investigated by the Food and Drug Administration, a Philadelphia woman developed dark rings around her eyes and one like a necklace around her throat. After using Gorod's Oriental Cream for several years, 2 years later, all her teeth loosened up. And her gums, now bluish blackish in color, became very sensitive. When her physician, suspicious of metallic poisoning, had the cream analyzed, it proved to be a suspension of calomel in water, and calomel is mercury chloride, just so you guys know. And her dentist, who had a good deal of experience with mercury poisoning in an industrial clinic, agreed that there was no doubt about her diagnosis. Bren says, really quickly, I'm going to read this, I'm always amazed how companies for a way and put chemicals in. Oh, okay. Unfortunately, Brent, your comment went a little bit quickly. I think what you were saying there was it's amazing that companies were putting this stuff into their products. And I agree, it is. For those countries that don't have stringent regulations today, this stuff still happens. Not too long ago, I did a video on hydroquinone. And unfortunately, there are other products out there, right, that use mercury to lighten the skin. Hydroquinone is not one of them. Hydroquinone is a different thing. But I think a lot of people were getting confused about the safety profile of hydroquinone because there are products out there that do use mercury compounds, and you need to be very wary of those. That is one of the reasons that you should really always buy a product that you trust, right? Something that you can purchase in stores, sometimes things that you can get online or you find through less than reputable means. You can get those without a doctor's prescription, for example, but they could be potentially dangerous, and that's a real thing, right? I know that the FDA does a lot to try to regulate exports, but they don't get everything, right? And I know the FDA is shorthanded. And so that is a challenge, right? And it's very important to make sure that you know what you're buying, which is part of the reason that I do this, is so that I'm able to talk about these things. Bren, I saw your comment on the hydroquinone video. And the Hair Lab liked it too. Wonderful. Thanks. And that's something that I would like to open up and talk about again in the future, because there are so many things when it comes to skin lightening, both from the science side and also from, what would you say, like the political or social aspect, which kind of ties into the science as well. And so it would be nice to do another video revisiting that in the future. All right, I'm gonna pick up again with Gorod's Oriental Cream, because I wanna get through that, and then we have one more story today before we do, yes, socio-cultural issues. Thank you, Hair Lab. We have 2 more stories to do. All right, so I'm gonna continue here. When Dr. Haven Emerson, one of the most distinguished health authorities in the U.S., testified at the hearings on the Copeland Food and Drug Bill, and as you guys remember, I said that the Copeland Food and Drug Bill was the bill before it became the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. In December 1933, he had this to say about cosmetics. As president of the Public Health Association and a member of the Public Health Committee of the Academy, I advise you that we are constantly observing at the medical centers in New York, through the Department of Dermatology and Medicine, the victims of the injudicious use of self-beautification efforts who come to us with many pathological conditions. Patients with deformed faces, patients with poisoned bodies, patients suffering at long time distance from the time when they use their medications, from chronic poisoning, which they could not themselves suspect from their own symptoms at the time of using the cosmetic. A matter which I think would be emphasized in the discussion of this bill is the chronicity. The long interval between the time of the application of these preparations and the beginning of the symptoms, which make it impossible for the individual consumers to protect themselves as they would against some violent irritant applied to the skin. Lead, silver, and arsenic are common types of chronic poisoning by cosmetics. And so, excuse me, this makes me think of a few things. One of the things is that we are concerned, it scares people, it is the, the fact that symptoms for cancer, or how do I say this? Symptoms from a product may not show up until well after you've used that product. And that's something that's definitely a concern to people. It's something that science is also trying to learn how to handle as well. And so like I said, when some of these topics are relevant to today, I mean, this is an example, right? When we think about cancer or things that can cause cancer, I know one of the things that, gets people concerned is you could use something and then way later on it could be problematic for you, right? And so all of these are things that science are trying to address and that the industry is also trying to address, because it's not only cosmetics, but it's a challenge as a whole, right? When it comes to cancer, there are so many things that can cause it. That really our science is evolving on this. Another thing that I don't know, Hair Lab, if you're still there, but you actually practice medicine, and I was wondering if you had anything to say about it. Feel free, if you do, to put it in the comments so that other people can benefit from your knowledge. All right, so I'm going to read our last story now, and the last story is about something called the last story is about Creme Lu. So we are going back to that. And Creme Lu was sold by a purveyor named Creme Lu, and the product used thallium acetate, which is a rat poison. And when I say that, let me address something really fast. And that is that things are generally poisonous in dosage, right? So at certain concentrations. And so the problem here is not only was she using something that was highly toxic, but her concentrations and her formulation varied. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that and why that caused problems. Here we go. All right. 2000s, it seemed indeed the blessing for which women have prayed for centuries, when Creme Lu announced her new method of devitalizing the hair follicle so that it can no longer produce hair. For over 40 years, Mrs. Lu confessed she had been trying to find some way of overcoming the I can never get this word right. Superfluous hair. Superfluous hair. There you go. Finally said it right. Superfluous hair on her own face and body. At last, though, the work of an eminent French chemist and her own willingness to be experimented on. All right, in quotes. Now we have Creme Lu cream, nature's rival, that creates baldness only where it is applied and just where you want it. On your face, arms, or any part of the body of either men or women. It is applied at night, the same as any good cold cream, and works while you sleep. Slowly but surely, and above all, safely. Of course, now we could all scratch our chins at that comment, because we know that that's not that true. It causes the follicle to relax and loosen its grasp on the hair. When the follicle is once devitalized, no more hair can ever grow in that spot again. It is unlike anything ever used before and offers, for the first time, real freedom from superfluous hair. End quote. Creme Lu really did seem different. For one thing, you had to pull out the hair in addition to using the cream so that nothing would obstruct its journey to the root. You continued to pull out the hair and rub in the cream for a year. That is a long time. After that, there would be no more hair. Mrs. Lu guaranteed it. But you had to use lots of cream at $5 an ounce, and no matter how discouraged you became, you could not get your money back before the year was up. It would not be fair to Mrs. Lu. Another thing, if you purchased Creme Lu, though, through a store, you had to save the empty jars to prove your claim. Let's see. And of course, you didn't have to stop using the cream just because the hair was gone. Many ladies continued to use it long after the hair growth had been removed because of its beneficial effects on the skin. Okay, so now here's what happened. Cora Lublin's story, as she revealed it to the inspector of the Food and Drug Administration, sheds an interesting light on the way some of our manufacturers operate, for her methods were not so unusual as her product, though the publicity given poisonous cosmetics in the last year or two had put some of the worst offenders out of business for the time being, or caused them to change their formulas temporarily. There is no way of knowing when they will start up again. Meanwhile, it will be instructive to see how they work their rackets. In the old days, when she ran a beauty parlor in New York, Mrs. Lu said she had a habit of collecting formulas for all sorts of beauty preparations. A Hungarian girl of her acquaintance, who was returned to the old country, asked for some of them to take back with her. Flipping through the pages of her notebook, Mrs. Lu noticed a clipping about thallium acetate as a depilatory. And for those of you guys who don't know, a depilatory is basically a hair remover. This, she claimed, was where she first got the idea of using the rat poison in a beauty cream. For the article had been written by Sabarode, the distinguished French authority on diseases of the scalp and hair. True enough, several years before, Sabarode had worked out a prescription calling for not more than 1% of thallium acetate as a treatment for certain scalp diseases, where removal of the hair is indicated. But the poisonous thallium acetate caused so many accidents that Sabarode stopped using the ointment himself and urged others to be cautious about it. Mrs. Lublin seemed to have been troubled by no such scruples. Seizing upon the idea of the formula, she went into a huddle with her family doctor and a pharmacist. The result? Creme Lu was the result. I'm going to pause here really fast just to take any questions. Does anybody have any? Because it is a long paragraph. And part of this, doing this thing live, is to chat with you guys as well. Beren says, did the companies know these chemicals were toxic when using them in cosmetics? I'll put a question mark there. I'm sure they would all say no, they didn't know that they were using poisonous products, right, or poisonous cosmetics at the time. And although cosmetics were not regulated pre-1938, what was regulated was drugs. They were regulated by an act called the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act. And in that act, what happened was they had to prove that the proprietor of a product, right, of a drug, they had to prove that that person was being knowingly deceptive, so that they were committing fraud. And that was apparently very difficult to prove, and it was a challenge. So in 1938, when they came up with the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, one of the things that they did was they said that the government didn't have to prove fraud. So whether you are knowingly selling something poisonous and you are either being deceptive about it, or you are not, let's say you don't know that it's poisonous, it doesn't matter. You shouldn't be selling it, and if it becomes too problematic, the government can do an injunction basically stopping you from selling it. So that is the state of things at the moment. But right now, again, these stories are about 1938, so a different time before cosmetics were regulated. All right, so I'm going to continue the story. Hopefully you guys are enjoying it. Or enjoying the stories, and I'm going to finish up here, and then we can chat a little bit and yeah, just answer some questions. Okay, let's see, where did I leave off though? Okay. I think I left off, I got a little lost here. All right, so I might be repeating some of this, but it's okay, we'll pick up again. All right, in the old days, when she ran a beauty parlor in New York, Mrs. Lublin said she had a habit of collecting formulas from all sorts of beauty preparations. A Hungarian girl of her acquaintance who was returning to the old country asked for some of them to take back with her. Flipping through the pages of her notebook, Mrs. Lublin noticed a clipping about thallium acetate as a depilatory. This, she claimed, was where she first got the idea of using the rat poison in a beauty cream. For the article had been distinguished by Sabarode, the distinguished French authority on diseases of the scalp and hair. True enough, several years before, Sabarode had worked out a prescription calling for not more than 1% of thallium acetate as a treatment for certain scalp diseases, where removal of the hair is indicated. But the poisonous thallium acetate caused so many accidents that Sabarode stopped using the ointment himself and urged others to be cautious about doing it. Mrs. Lublin seemed to have been troubled by no such scruples. Seizing upon the idea of the formula, she went in a huddle with her family doctor and a pharmacist. Creme Lu was the result. When the small percentage of thallium acetate in the first batch of Creme Lu failed to get desired results, Mrs. Lublin increased the dose to 3.25%. Her method of controlling the amount would have made a scientist tear his hair. Mrs. Lublin herself would take out 2 of the original unopened 100-gram jars of thallium acetate and give them to one of the 2 girls who made the cream for her. These 2 jars were then mixed with a base to make 150 jars of Creme Lu. By thus using only 2 jars of thallium acetate to the batch, she reasoned that an excess of the poison could not be used, though she employed no safeguards against uneven mixing. Not until adverse criticisms of Creme Lu began to roll in did she have a chemical analysis made. Then her advertising agent called the Peace Laboratories, which reported 5% of thallium acetate as compared with 7% found by the American Medical Association. Such variations are hardly surprising in view of the slapstick methods of manufacture, but they may explain why some women who use several jars, probably of plain, if high-priced grease, escaped injury, while others getting only one jar, but that contained the poison, almost lost their lives. So there she did not have good manufacturing practices. Mrs. Loveland didn't. And it explains why some people were poisoned and some people weren't, which is pretty scary. Let me see if I have anything else or if that's it. Wow, okay, so that's it. Certainly there's a lot more to the story, and like I mentioned, I am going to be sharing the link to this book in the description because it's public access for all to read, and I highly encourage you to read it. A lot of the debates are really interesting. They seem applicable today, and I think it's really interesting to try to understand our cosmetic regulation by understanding some of the things that have happened in our past. And I felt like I got a really good sense of doing it while reading this book. And just so you know, to give you some back history for those of you guys who didn't start out watching this video, is this book was written by the FDA 2 years before the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act came in place. And the reason it was written is because they were being criticized. People thought that they were being callous, thought that they were being indifferent to a lot of the atrocities that were happening. And the response from Ruth DeForest Lamb, that was their chief educational officer, was she wanted to write a book to say, no, I actually hear you. It's not that we don't care about you. It's that we can't do anything about it because we have no legal ability to do anything about it. And so they were pushing for the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act as well. And what that allowed, what that act, I guess, gave us, what it granted us, was the ability to have cosmetics regulated for the first time, which was amazing that they weren't regulated before that. Also allowed the government to not have to prove fraud every time. So they didn't have to prove that you intended to hurt people. It's just if you hurt people now, that's not okay. It also gave the authority of factory inspections, which is pretty awesome. And then also it allowed federal court injunctions. So if you are selling a product that is completely not okay, it lets the government bar you from doing so. We have a comment from Whole Grains Video, said, this would be cool to read the horror stories. Yes, around Halloween. It would be actually interesting to read it around Halloween time, but one of the reasons that I picked it is because this stuff really affects us at any time, right? It's affecting us right now. I know Hair Lab brought up earlier that there are some challenges that cosmetic is having with preservatives, right? Because people want to go preservative free. And that really begs the question, can some of the stuff happen today? And it can, and that's why you really have to be aware of what ingredients are in your cosmetics, right? It may not happen at the level to which this happened, right? For example, like the Lash Lure thing where someone has died from their cosmetics. But it really, there are things that can happen today that can be, I would say, equally problematic, right? And it's something that the cosmetic industry tries to guard against, and there's a healthy debate over who's responsible for that, right? Is it the government's responsibility to protect us? Is it our responsibility to protect us? We're going to be talking about some of that in future videos. In fact, we're talking about some of it now, right? I think that it's something on many people's minds. So I wanted to talk about one more act that was really kind of important in all of this that kind of gets glossed over a lot of the times, and that was in 1966, the Fair Packaging and Labeling Act also came out, and that required that people had to put labels on their products. They had to identify what the products are. They had to name the place of the business, right? Which is really important, because if you have something happen to you because of your cosmetics, you got to know where to go to complain about it. So there was that portion of things, and then they had to put the net quantity of contents on the products as well, and that was just to kind of have honest selling, right? So you know how much you're getting when you purchase a product. And so anyway, the book covers not only cosmetics, but it includes food and drugs as well. And of course, one of the things in the story that I talked about in my video that I actually didn't bring up until now in this session was that there was this case of sulfanilamide poisoning, right? So it was a drug poisoning that happened to 100 people that really got the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act to pass. And it wasn't actually, cosmetics helped in that, but it wasn't like the deciding factor. Hi, Technical and Anon TV. How are you doing? It's good to see you. You are catching us at the tail end of our live session here, but thank you for coming anyway. We had a reading of the American Chamber of Horrors, right? That was something that was written by Ruth DeForest Lamb. She was the chief educational officer at the FDA at a very tough time for the cosmetics industry. And that was a time before cosmetics were regulated. And we were just talking a little bit about the debates that happened then, some of the atrocities that happened then, that people suffered at the hands of their cosmetics, but also how this relates to things now. And I think we're gonna take maybe 1 or 2 more minutes if anybody has any questions or just wants to say anything. Feel free to say it now, otherwise we're gonna cut it off here, but just know that you can make comments in this video and I will read them, and I'm also gonna put the link to this book in the comments as well, so that you can read this for yourself and you can be informed. And hopefully, I don't know, you guys just found this interesting and helpful. I thought it'd be a kind of a cool and relaxing way to spend a Sunday would be just to listen to someone read to you, and also just ask questions and just have a nice discussion. So all right, it looks like that's about it for now. Thank you guys so much for your time. I appreciate it. I hope you guys have a wonderful Sunday wherever you are. Can we get a quick shout out of just where people are from? Because I'm just curious and I would like to do this more often too. So if you have suggestions, because I have not done a lot of YouTube lives, it would be great to hear where you guys are from, because I would love to hear where you're from, and then also what you guys would like to see on this channel, or how I can provide you guys better lives in the future. Yay, Japan and Canada! Hello, Japan and Canada. I am here in San Francisco, California, actually Sausalito, so that's right across the Golden Gate Bridge, broadcasting live. Feels good to be here. Oh, from India, excellent. I used to work in India, actually, Technical and Non-TV. I used to work in Mumbai, and I've also been to Delhi. Anyway, but it's good to see you guys here. I would love to create more of a community on YouTube, and I felt like it was on me to take the first step, to be present, and just have a conversation. Today it's a reading. Next week it will be something else. Let me know what you're interested in, and maybe that's what we'll talk about next week. But I want to be here, I want to be present, and I want to be available for you guys, so that you guys are learning, and we learn together. This isn't a one-way thing. I learn all the time as I research and study stuff, and I'm so grateful to have you guys here, and have also your expertise, right? I mean, we get great people here. We have the Hair Lab joining us today, whose content I watch on both Instagram, and she actually has a blog, so it's great to see her here, and really it is a two-way street. We learn from each other. So all right, I'll talk to you guys later. Take care, and honestly, if you want to catch the whole thing from the beginning, I'll be on Instagram too. All right, take care, bye. Let's see, how do I say goodbye to you all? All right, awkward moment. Let's see how I close out of this.